Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Smuggling Hope podcast, designed to give you access to resources to increase in truth, freedom, and love. And the effort of this podcast is to provide Catholic counsel to the community free of charge and to really address the concerns that people have in their marriages, in their families, with their mental health, with their relationships, with the changing tide of the culture and the chaos in which we all live in our modern age. And so want to give people access to what we know works, things built on research or the tried and tested and proven resources that the Catholic faith provides. And sometimes people will ask me well, why am I, why is it that I specifically have gone in this route of really trying to promote Catholicism? And primarily, it's not because Catholicism is easy or that it is convenient or, it's actually a very high there's a very high expectation that Christ holds for people that practice the Catholic faith. And what I think is one of the most powerful things is that it's true, right? So if you are a person who listens to this podcast and okay, this guy, sometimes, things we talk about on this show, are very sciencey. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're philosophical. Sometimes they're just, psychobabblish, I guess. And maybe that's a phrase Dr. Phil came up with. I don't know. But if you're ever interested in the truth and you want to be a student of history and the truth, you'll end up, if you really want it, you'll end up in the Catholic Church. Fulton Sheen used to say 90% of people, they don't disagree with what the church is. They disagree with what they think the church is. And so Catholic Church is, by my estimation, the most highly censored religion in the world and, has some of the most profound and interesting propaganda to make sure that people never enter it or that people leave it. So today on the podcast, what I'm going to be sharing with you is really how to build, increase your emotional currency in all your relationships, the relationships you have with your children, with your friends, with your spouse, with your girlfriend or boyfriend, and really learning how to get really good at forming connections and being able to enhance our relationships. And we go through some of the love language concepts that Gary Chapman has promoted in his work and his books, The 5 Love Languages. And I'll put a link to that book in the show notes for anybody interested. I don't think that is the only 5 love languages, but I will say that it's a good place for a lot of people to start. So I talk about that on today's episode. Before we get into that, I want to kind of give a shout out to all of the supports of the podcast. And again, if you have enjoyed the podcast and you have found it helpful and you want to support or promote it, please give us a 5-star review or click subscribe on YouTube or on Spotify or on any of the platforms where we are available. I think we're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube. Those are the primary ones, but obviously get it on iHeartRadio or whatnot. So, but yeah, and if you give us a 5-star review, obviously it helps people to find the show and find it available to them. And so again, the more people that know about it, the better, the more that this information gets out into the community and into people's lives. I would hope that, it's helpful. Again, the goal is to help make therapeutic people and communities so that our life and our world in many ways continues to improve, right? And people encounter the truth. First, a shout out to Mezzanine Creative. Mezzanine Creative is a private design firm, really to do any of your branding needs for small business, right? If you want to take your brand design to the next level, check out Mezzanine Creative. They've designed our banners for YouTube and for Spotify. It's done a great job with all of that. So can't be thankful enough for all of the hard work and the creative endeavors over there. So if you got a small business and you're looking for someone to make a logo or promote your business, whether it's digital marketing, design, contact Mezzanine, .co. And you can check the link in the show notes for all of the supports of the podcast, including Mezzanine. The next up on the support role is the Buffalo Chesterton Academy. Buffalo Chesterton Academy is a classical high school in the Catholic tradition. And classical high school, as I've talked about on this podcast, is essentially teaching young people the development and evolution of Western freedom of thought, right? The evolution of freedom of thought, right? So this is the unit of properties of education, the character, the intellect, and the intellect, the character, and the spiritual dimensions all in the person, right? And so fantastic, fantastic curriculum and a great school. I have two children, two teens that actually attend that. Again, it's been a blessing for our family. So if you want to check it out, you can go to buffalochestertonacademy.org. O-R-G. There's a link in the show notes to that. Check it out. We've had a lot of increasing interest in Chesterton academies throughout the country. I think there's been anywhere from 50 to 72 of these schools pop up in the last maybe decade or so. The growth in classical education, the desire for people to keep an awareness of the freedom of thought and the classics of literature, from philosophy and Shakespeare, the classic languages of Latin, and learning all of these things to understand what has got us this far in society. So again, if you want to look up Chesterton Academy or you want to find one of your own, you're going to click the show notes after the show's over. And last but not least is the Hearts Renewed program. So Hearts Renewed is an online marriage transformation program that I designed. It took me about 7 years to put together. And primarily it runs people through, essentially what works in marriage, both based on research and gives people dynamic exercises really to, cultivate the relationship they want to be. So we have people that are, engaged, people that have been married for decades. And this program is, super powerful because it removes the tension around fears, around negative conversations. The activities and conversations are designed to promote kindness to one another and to promote the positive aspects of your relationship, while also allowing you to deal with the difficult and courageous conversations that come with marriage. So it covers everything from parenting to sex to boundaries, and interfamily or interpersonal conflict and regulations of emotions. If and when people have new material they want added to the program, that is always a worthy addition. So right now you can check that program out for $1. If you go to heartsrenewed.org and you put in the coupon code RENEW1, and that will allow you to try the program for the first 7 days for $1. So again, if you would spend, probably more than that on a cup of coffee, it kind of comes down to, are you actually, interested in investing in your relationship and your marriage? And I think that's something that's really been on my mind, really, is like, what do we value? And, what do I value? What do you value? But really, where are we putting our efforts? So check that out if you want. I've gotten a lot of great feedback on that program. It continues to be something that I think is a great benefit. And I designed it because a lot of people were not going for marriage counseling, or they wait too long, or they are afraid of counselors, or they're afraid of getting a secular counselor that's going to convince them to get divorced or convince them to go engage in sinful activities. Virtuous people that are trying to maintain they're trying to be financially responsible, right? That program doesn't cost. It probably costs less than, you can finish the whole program for less than probably maybe 2 date nights, right? You go out twice a month, you could finish that whole program with the same cost, right? So it's very cost effective. Don't have to get childcare. You can do it from the comfort of your own home, and you can do it in segments. If you can spend a half an hour watching The Office, the TV show The Office, with your significant other, with your spouse tonight, well, then you can do this program. Okay, do it after the kids go down, whatever way you want to do it, and see it like a game, right? So enough about all that. So check that out. I continue. If you know somebody that is married or struggling in their marriage, have them try that program. There's also a whole heap load of free downloads available on the Spotify show notes, right? So if you go to Spotify, if you're looking at this on YouTube, go to Spotify or go to heartsrenewed.org and check out all the free resources. You got stuff that covers marriage and intimacy. Sex and intimacy. We got stuff that helps bring peace to people's home in the format of the family culture download. So, in a marriage seminar that's on there. So check that stuff out. You don't have to kind of give me any money to get access to that. Okay, so on with the show. So today, what we're talking about really is the concept of emotional currency and the relationships we have with people, right? And so obviously we all want closer relationships. and we want people in our family to know that we love them. So the odd part is just to realize that everybody pays attention to different things in the relationship. Your spouse, your children, your husband, they all kind of feel loved in different ways. And so oftentimes we think that the way we're loved is the way that other people are loved, because we're all kind of victims of our own bubble. And so one of the goals of this conversation is to help you to be open to and be curious about the people around you so you learn how to love them better instead of getting upset that they're not loving you the way you want to be loved. And a lot of times I think that that's where we're at, right? And, and I think that that's one of those like very difficult situations, right? I mean, years ago, I had an older couple come to see me. They've been married many years, and their children had asked them to come and see me, and they had had the same conflict for a number of years. And the husband and wife, who had at that time been married longer than I had been alive, probably, were like, "Kid, what are you going to do for us? You can't do anything for us. We've been we've been in this for the whole time for decades and decades, and we've had the same problems." And I said, "Well, I mean, I think that if we can figure out like what your needs are, I think we can kind of make some headway." Because even though I mean, I struggle with being a melancholy person, I am psychotically optimistic in certain departments of my life. So we sat down and we had a conversation for maybe an hour and a half. And what the original complaint was is that the husband believed his wife was reckless. She was always spending too much money. She was always overspending. And the wife believed that he was controlling and he was a tightwad and that he never wanted to have fun. And they had had this conflict for years. And then by the end of our conversation, everybody in the room learned was that, the husband had a really intense need to protect his wife, right? He had an intense need to protect his wife, and that would come across to her as obviously controlling. And the wife, at the same time, like she felt she had a need really to feel respected, and really like she wanted to have, really to be given freedom. Right? She wanted to be. Well, she had this need to, to be free and to be really supported. For him to really, see goodness in her activities and her desire to beautify the home and things. She just wanted to be acknowledged. But the two of them for almost 40 years didn't see that. They saw each other as one was trying to destroy them financially and the other was trying to control them. And that's the way a lot of our marriages can be, because a lot of times in marriage or conflict with your kids or conflict at work is instead of being curious, we are afraid. And like we've talked about on this podcast many times, when we talk about relationships, is we're always in this perpetual state of evaluation. We don't see people as they are, or even as they're trying to advocate for their needs. We just hear criticism or we experience their fears or aggressions. And like we talked about last week's podcast, and we talked about bids for connection. This is in some ways an add-on or an extension of that, because we really want to, we want to make sure we're capitalizing on these bids, and making sure that we're, putting effort where it's going to move the needle, right? So I want you to think that, so everybody pays attention differently. Everybody has a different experience of how they feel loved. So the first thing is for you to understand how you feel loved. What is your love language, right? And so sometimes it's helpful to recognize this by what it is that you do complain about or what you wish you could complain about, because, and I'm not saying that you are complaining, but this is actually a need, right? I desire for my husband to do this. I desire my wife to do that. I desire my parents to say this, my father, my mother to do this. And I want you to recognize like what it is that would make you feel loved, right? So think about like a time where you felt really loved by whoever, right? Because we have different needs and different ways of being loved in different relationships, right? So I'm not in my friendships are not going to have the same intensity or expectation as my marriage. And that's going to be also different than the expectation and experience of love for my children, because there's just different types of relationships, right? And a friendship is going to be different than, the child relationship different than the marriage. So think about like how you want to be loved. And think about a time where you felt most loved by your spouse or most loved by your parents or by your boyfriend or by your girlfriend. Those experiences of terms of, that's a time where I really did feel that experience. That should give you the starting point of really like what it is that makes you feel loved. And it could be that, your wife came home and she had bought something for you from the store, and she thought of you, or could have been, a conversation you had, and you felt really loved by your spouse when they told you how much they appreciate you. You could have felt really loved when your husband stayed up late and fixed the lawnmower so that he could mow the lawn the next day. I mean, again, it's dangerous to believe that everybody feels the same way you do and everybody feels loved the same way you do, right? So think about that. And I encourage people as they do this, listen to this podcast, is really to make a reference, to write it down, to think about these things. Because again, if we're not aware of these things, we can't get good at them, right? So what is your love language? Now, Gary Chapman in his book, The Five Love Languages, outlines really five core love languages that he identifies. The first one is words of affirmation. So words of affirmation are telling people you look very attractive, or, that suit looks nice on you, or that dress looks nice on you, or that dinner was great, and all that. So some people want words of affirmation, and some people they'll complain. They'll be like, "You never say I look good. You never say that you never say like that you appreciate, right? That I go to work or I take care of the kids, or you never tell me that whatever the case might be." Kids want to feel, words of affirmation as well. Now, a word on kids for those of you that are parents listening to this, words of affirmation with other people is it's important that when you give affirmation to people, that it become something that is specific, right, and detailed if possible. The reason is that the brain detects whether or not it's genuine, right? And so genuineness of a compliment or affirmation really has to do with the detail, right? The detail of it, and that the brain thinks it's more authentic, right? If you're vague, right? If you're vague, the mind starts to believe that it's a manipulation, and it starts to be thinking it's not genuine, and it kind of distances it. So, again, words of affirmation. So that's one component. When it comes to words of affirmation with kids, especially, one thing that is just a word of warning: as you raise your kids on this podcast, we did, in the very beginning, we did an episode which was called "That God Does Not Believe in Failure," and in that podcast, I talked about how there's a growth mindset. Growth mindset means that everything is learning, right? That failure isn't fatal. That every setback in life is an opportunity. For kids to have a growth mindset, you want to praise kids for their effort, not for their accomplishment. Super important. You want to praise kids for their effort and not their accomplishment. Okay. So words of affirmation, I'm really impressed with your effort and in your time practicing soccer. I'm super impressed by the fact that you stayed up late to finish the dishes. I'm super impressed that you know, I've been seeing you study all week for your exam. It's not that I'm so impressed that they got an A plus. It's that they studied all week. That attitude allows people to have more of a growth mindset as they grow up. So I encourage you to avoid focusing on achievement. Achievement makes people have a fixed mindset as they grow up, because then they have this anxiety about performance and having to be perfect. And any place where they can't be perfect, they avoid. They also become very prickly when it comes to getting feedback. So with your kids, especially for the parents listening to this, we want to praise our kids based on their effort, not on their accomplishments and achievements. Okay. So that's the first love language, words of affirmation. And again, sometimes you can be kind of, if you have family members that are tricky with this, like they don't take compliments very easily, you can give a compliment in the form of a question. So if my daughter is doing the dishes and I say to her like, "Wow, what a wonderful job you've done on the dishes. I really appreciate that." She might be really receptive to that a lot, but maybe not. It's very different to say, "Wow, how did you get all these dishes done? And it took you like 15 minutes. We had so many people here for dinner. How did you do it? When I say that kind of compliment, it forces her, the question forces her to encounter her goodness, and I disappear. And she encounters her goodness, right? So when we ask a question to give a compliment, we disappear and the person experiences their goodness and they become grateful and they feel like they feel grateful for our presence. Us being the one responsible for making them feel good, it protects us from getting into that dynamic where we have to be the one to make people feel good all the time. Because I know there's a lot of people that would be listening to this and be like, oh, I don't want to be my kid's cheerleader. I don't want to be my husband's cheerleader or my wife's cheerleader. Well, sometimes that is what your spouse or your kids need. Also, though, I think it's helpful to figure out ways to essentially build them up without their knowledge, right? Or, for them to see the goodness in them, because that is important. So the words of affirmation, right? That goes a long way for a lot of people. The second love language is quality time, right? Like I've talked about this on the podcast, is with kids especially, this is important, is with kids, it's not necessarily about the quality of time, meaning like, oh, we went away to Disney World or went fly fishing in Utah or something. It's the quantity of time, the fact that I want to spend time with you, the fact that this is important. And so when we hear the word quality time, I want you to think that like really it is the priority of communicating to the person, I do want to be with you. I choose to be with you. And there are a lot of people that struggle with fears of abandonment, if your mother or father divorced or they left you, or you've had like some very traumatic experiences where you fear abandonment for whatever reason, oftentimes you're going to see that a hunger you have is for quality time, to know that that person wants to be with you, that chooses to be with you. Obviously, it's not a prerequisite, and that's not the reason why love languages exist, but it is, so for many people, a hunger that they have. Some people it's not. Some people they don't desire it at all. So the second love language is quality time. And again, you can tell what the love language is oftentimes based on the complaint. Why don't you ever spend time with me? That may not even be a true statement, okay? So don't get defensive when you hear it. Why don't you ever spend time with me? Why don't you ever want to sit with me on the couch? Why don't we ever go out on dates? Why don't, you're always so busy. You just care more about work than me. These complaints and these criticisms, behind them all is a currency of connection, this love language. And maybe it is quality time. And so you want to kind of, figure out how to work that in. Usually, with any of these love languages, you're going to find that it's a challenge for you to do these things because they're not things you value. Like you just don't value. You might not value quality time. You're like, you might not value, words of affirmation. Nobody needs to tell me anything. I'm good. I'm good. I don't need anybody to tell me I'm good. So just realize, just because you don't need this doesn't mean your significant other, your child, your spouse doesn't need it. So then the third love language is, the acts of service, right? So acts of service mean doing things in support of the other person. So for instance, I think later today, my wife had asked me, which again, I think this is a very powerful thing, that she trusts me and she asked me to do something in the house to fix insulation in a part of our home. So I'm going to do that. That's an act of service. Again, is that her only love language? No, but it is a love language to do these things. And, so the act of service, it could be, and again, like a lot of people, their love language is how they love the other person, right? So my wife loves me, I think, a lot by taking care of the house, doing the laundry, preparing a meal, spending a lot of time on these wonderful things. That is her primary, or that is one of her primary love languages, because she does that towards me. Super important that I recognize that. Otherwise, for her to love me and for me to not acknowledge that is hurtful to her. It also would be upsetting to me, right? Well, my wife doesn't love me. Well, she does. She loves you all the time. but I need to also respond in her primary currency also at times, which is the love language, right? So, or which is the acts of service. So acts of service can be that, I mean, your children may want you to drive them places. They may, I mean, these might be things that they want, right? So acts of service, pretty self-explanatory with that. But the next, the next, love language is is going to be, and gift giving is a little different than what people think. It's not giving gifts, for recognition. It's really giving gifts that in many ways reflect that you think about the person when you're not around them, right? So if you're picking up a gift for one of your kids in the airport on the way home, your kid loves that because you're thinking about them when you're away. Or if you're purchasing flowers for your spouse, right? Are you buying roses because that's the social stereotypical trap? Or did you get flowers that make you think of your spouse, right? Because in my relationship with my wife, if I get her roses in a lot of ways, that in some ways, and it took me a while to realize this, is that can be almost thoughtless because my wife, when I think of my wife, I don't really think about roses. She doesn't really like desire roses. She likes other types of flowers. And so if I'm really going to give her a gift and I'm thinking about her, I have to think about, well, what does this person prefer? What is it that I think about when I think about this person? Um, and that way there's like almost a hidden knowledge. So again, I think that gift giving is powerful for people, and some people are better at it than others. But it really is acknowledging, like, when you think about this person, what makes you think about them? And it does not need to be an extravagant gift. A lot of people, I think, and again, we're going to come up on Christmas and holidays and birthdays that people are having, but in my family, like we've got like half of our birthdays are in Christmas, right? So you got to budget accordingly. And so with Christmas though, you have people that are you got to buy gifts for a lot of people. They decide to exchange gifts, and it's a good assessment of, do you know people? Do you know the people that you live with? Do you know your children? Do you know your spouse? Do you know your parents, your friends, your people at work? Do you know them? Can you think about them thoughtfully? And what is it that they enjoy? What is it that delights them? What is it that you associate with them? And I mean, I always think it's a good assessment is, do I have to ask this person what they want? Or can I think about it and can I generate something that would be delightful? And some people are easier to purchase things for, and some people are harder to purchase things for. You know what I mean? And what I've come to figure out from my own perspective, I think, is that I think a lot of it has to do with how easily the person communicates their needs. And in my own life, I would say that I am a very difficult person to buy gifts for, although people still aspire to do it. And it's not anybody's fault. As I was preparing for this podcast, I think really it is that I do not very easily communicate my needs. And I don't actually think about specifically what I need. And that's something we're talk about in a minute when it comes to these love languages. And so people don't know how to anticipate my needs. And so I have to get better at that myself. So gift giving is another form of love language, right? And you just notice not everybody wants gifts. And again, like I said, there are people that give very extravagant gifts, and oftentimes they give them from a place of guilt, or a place where they're like, well, I really want to do this, or they do this with their spouse, or they do this with their girlfriend, because they either they're afraid, or they really want to impress them. There's a level of anxiety, and usually, and this may sound odd, is that the intensity of gift giving for a lot of people, if it's kind of off kilter or off balance, it's like, well, why am I going to give my wife like an $8,000 necklace? I'm just making this up. That's kind of unnecessary, right? Now, if my wife needed or had like a great joy in obtaining large pieces of jewelry, I guess that might make sense. But that's also kind of, I think it may cheapen the relationship, right? And so what you see sometimes is like the more that we're expending on certain things, we almost drive down the meaning of the relationship. So be careful about this as you get into the holidays. And a lot of parents I know people buy their kids and everybody like a lot of gifts, and they go into debt. A lot of people go into debt during Christmas. You should not go into debt during the holiday time. I don't think. I just don't think that that's a helpful thing to do. And because again, like the more things you purchase for somebody, if your kid has 15 gifts, 20 gifts, the actual experience is diminished because they don't value those gifts. They value it less and less and less because they have so much. When you have so much, you value what you have even less. I know it sounds odd, but you know that this is true. I mean, if you give a kid, if you purchase like 20 different things and $500 for this video game system, and they've got a new bike, and I got them this, and I got them that, yeah, they'll be grateful, but they don't understand what they have. There's just too many things. So try to be thoughtful about your children, especially, or whoever you're buying gifts for, so that the gifts that you give have to do with thought and not guilt and not this expectation of social trap. Because remember, and again, Christmas has become, for many people, this holiday of high stakes marketing and feeling bad for there's like a lack of relationship. So we have to buy things and exchange the relationship we have with our family for stuff. And I think that that's a bad trade-off. So I would encourage you to find more ways to deepen your knowledge of people as you approach the holiday season. And if you feel like it's like an anxiety of, I got to get all this done, well, slow down, because you shouldn't be doing this all from a place of fear or judgment or agitation. So we have gift giving, words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, right? And then we have physical touch. So physical touch is something where people, I think, confuse it. They confuse it with sexual touch. Sexual touch can be part of it, but when we say physical touch, is to communicate to the other person with the use of our body that we love them. In the way that we do that with a handshake with somebody at work to feel close to them, right? There's a lot of men over the course of my life that when I would go to work with them, they would feel like they either have to embrace me or they have to grab my hand in a certain way or a certain gesture, because they're very physical people. And that's how they convey that everything was okay or that they cared about. With your kids, are you able to hug them? With your spouse, are you able to be close, to hug them, to touch them, to kiss them? These things, physical touch, the communication of love and affection for other people through the use of the body is important. Again, it is a sensory thing, right? All of these things, these love languages, are different senses that we have attuned to, right? And so a lot of people, like, they hunger just to be held or just to be touched, men and women. And it does not mean that it must lead to a sexual experience. For that caveat, right, with sexual experience and everything, we have a earlier podcast called The Discipline of Desire, for people who really want to understand sexual desire and the arc of sexual and sexual behavior and physical touch as it extends into the marital union. I would listen to that episode because we go a mile deep in that direction. This episode, we're not going to go too much into that. Now, if you want to know how to utilize all of these love languages and your specific experiences of being loved, especially in your marriage, the Hearts Renewed program does that. It gives you a whole formula of how to have a conversation and to generate ways to increase your emotional currency in your marriage. And emotional currency is that exchange of positive emotion where you feel loved in your relationship, right? So if I have a strong emotional currency with my son or my daughter or my boss or my wife, we have the ability to tolerate more difficult stuff and we can have greater intimacy in the sense that we can talk about more legitimate needs, right? What do I actually need at work? What do I actually need in my marriage? What do I need as the child with my father, with my mother, with my kid? What do I need? Higher levels of emotional currency allow us to have more stability, and to be able to really cope effectively with difficult situations that just come up, right? Now, when we have difficult situations or we have struggles in our relationships, whether it's with our boss, with our kid, with our spouse, if we have a higher level of emotional currency where that person feels loved by us or cared for by us, when we make a withdrawal from that bank account, from that emotional bank account, when we make a withdrawal, what happens is that, we still stay in the black, right? Because there's additional stuff in that emotional bank account. Yeah, my boss said this, but I know that he or she really does care about me, even though this happened at work. I know that my wife loves me and I'm not going to take this personal. Or I know, that my husband loves me and I'm not going to take this personal, or my dad or my mom or what. So knowing love languages, knowing how to love people, or knowing how to, in many ways, minister to the people around you and make them feel close or connected is a huge benefit. So I can't stress that enough, right? So understand your love language. I guess that's the first part. The second part is to understand other people's love languages. And oftentimes, again, you can recognize the love languages in other people based on what are they complaining about, and what it is that makes them, you know, light up. What are the things that really help them to relax, help them to be more cooperative. And it's not about manipulation. It's really not. It's about relationship, right? We want to have relationship, and that relationship is built with emotional currency. No currency, no relationship, right? You know, um, so we want to understand the other people's love language. And again, you can, on our program, I think in Hearts Renewed, we actually have couples assess their love language and go through things and take a little quiz. And you can go online and you can take any quiz you want on the love languages, and it should give you a general synopsis of what your love language tendencies are. But I think it's helpful if you're doing this with a family member or your kids or your spouse, have them write down, like, I feel most loved by you when dot dot dot, right? It's kind of a unique thing. There's a this thing that I came across at one point where, really asking your kids specifically. I mean, this is what I told my wife I want for Father's Day from my kids, is just really for them to write down, like, a couple things, maybe one or two things that they really find has been memorable, or times where they felt loved by me in the last year, and what I can do better as a father. And I think that is going to be worth more than another tie or another gift card. Although those are lovely, don't get me wrong. My kids love me. I don't actually know what I do that makes my kids feel loved. And what I've discovered from my children is they find things like driving them to the bus stop, or watching a funny video with them, or, like I said on last week's episode, listening to their music. All of these exchanges, that seem maybe very minuscule or mundane, are huge things, right? To sit with my spouse, like sit next to her on the couch, that might be a huge thing. To make sure I spend a little bit of time at the end of the night with my spouse praying. These things might be a big deal. To kiss my spouse hello or good morning or whatnot. So what is it that makes you feel most loved by? So be curious enough about that. And don't take this attitude that you're doing something wrong. Realize that you are already doing. I think it's important, people, on this episode, that you understand you are doing things that make people feel loved by you. The trick is that you probably don't know what that is, and you're probably still thinking about yourself, because that's how we are as people. So we're thinking about, well, I'm not being loved in this way, or I wish I was loved in this way. Okay, that's true. Well, this is the part where you communicate that, right? This is when I feel most loved by you, when you do this. So we want to be curious instead of being afraid. And when you see complaints come up in your marriage, at work, with your relationships with your kids, with your parents, whoever, see complaints as opportunities for learning about the other person's needs. Any complaint should be interpreted as, you know, a hidden or disguised need. Now, the last thing in this episode I want to really cover with you and talk about is, you really do not want to wait around for others to provide all your emotional needs, right? Which I think a lot of people in this day and age, like, they're very upset. They're like, oh, well, I'm not getting my emotional needs met. Well, your emotions superseded everybody else in your life for the most part, right? Your emotions existed before you got married. Your emotions existed before you had kids. And if somebody's responsible for your emotional needs, well, that means that somehow they're going to control you, right? So we really don't want to make other people responsible for things unless we want to lose some level of our autonomy. Now, this can happen, though, for a variety of reasons, and most of it is because we lack what we call self-compassion. So there's a psychological, attribute that we call empathy. Empathy, there's two types of empathy. There's emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is what I'm going to kind of talk about on the podcast today. Emotional empathy is I feel what other people feel. I can feel what other people feel. And caretakers, especially women, over the course of caretaking, people in medicine, people who are caring for the dying, caring for the sick, caring for little kids, they can become very empathetic, sometimes even more empathetic than needed, and it can be very upsetting sometimes because they're always feeling what other people are feeling. It can make them very anxious, very distracted, very upset. But so that's an emotional empathy. And then the other form of empathy, which has more long-term value, is what we call cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy is understanding how to read objectively, well, what is the appropriate need in a given situation. So instead of feeling things or assessing things in a sense of like what needs to actually happen for all parties involved. And that usually takes a more narrative approach, meaning like that the person has an active storytelling in the mind, right? And so they can, cognitive empathy helps people to take care of themselves more. Emotional empathy, I think, oftentimes lends itself to caring for others, right? So emotional empathy, if you think about the two, it's like I think a couple weeks ago we did an episode on civility, on liberalism and conservatism. Psychological traits of conservatives are usually more cognitively empathetic, right? They have more cognitive empathy in the sense that there's this logisticin, more logical. I've got maintaining stability, of self in that order, where emotional empathy lends itself to really being focused outside of the self towards the needs of others. So again, it's not that one is better than the other, but usually uh, the emotional empathy can run rampant and cause problems in the sense of I don't take care of myself. And then obviously, like cognitive empathy can make us maybe not as interested in other people, but we take care of ourselves. So we have to balance it. And so with empathy, emotional empathy goes on a bell curve. And on one end of the curve, we have what we call people with no empathy, no ability to feel what other people feel. With this emotional empathy, they are people that we would call our sociopaths. They see people as objects, and this could be because they have a neurological problem. They have maybe a lesion to their brain. It could be that they have some form of damage to the brain. They could have some kind of a spectrum of inability to recognize the needs of other people. So those are people that we categorize as like kind of sociopathological, right? They don't see people as human. They don't recognize themselves and other people. And then you have the other side of the bell curve, which is people that have so much empathy that they no longer exist because everything is about everybody else. Those people have what we call unmitigated communion. Unmitigated communion in the form of emotional empathy is something that we don't talk a lot about in the field of psychological sciences or therapy, because I think a lot of us sometimes have it. Therapist people, we have it where we think a lot or think too much about the needs of our clients and what they feel and what's going on. And again, that maybe in some ways we would say that's a very compassionate approach, but it can also really be damaging to the individual. So what is the antidote to this is what we call self-compassion. And so if you're a person who really is struggling with that unmitigated communion where you're very nervous or distressed by the needs of other people and what's going on with your children or people in the community or people you see on TV or people on social media, or you're very fixated or afraid in your marriage, or you feel like you're walking on eggshells with your husband or with your wife or with your kids. I want you to think about objectively, we would come up with some behaviors or things, rituals that you can do that are acts of love for yourself. And the easiest way to do that is to speak it out in a narrative, right? So if you're a mom with 4 little kids and your husband works a lot and you put the kids down to sleep 5 out of 7 days by yourself and you eat dinner alone or you eat dinner alone with your kids and, you don't get a lot of sleep. Well, if you loved that woman with those 4 kids and who was doing all this work for her husband, who was doing a lot of work for the family, that woman, if you loved her, what would you want her to do? Maybe we would say like that she needs to get a babysitter and talk to her husband and go out for a night. Or maybe, she needs to get a babysitter for herself so she can go to coffee if she can do that. Or she needs to take a bath when her husband is back in time or in town and be able to get some reprieve. When we do acts of love, it usually starts to break apart the judgmentalness that we have and the anxiety we have about having to be perfect and do everything emotionally perfect and feel perfect in every relationship. So these rituals of self-compassion, right, doing things that are loving for ourselves, help us to better attend to the needs of those around us. So that's something that I would encourage you to think about, right, if you're struggling with this. And even if you're not, I think that very compassionate people still need to break out of these experiences where they are taking care of themselves. Because remember, you cannot hold everybody responsible for your emotional needs. You can't dump that on your husband. You can't dump that on your wife or your kids. You can't expect your boss to meet all your needs. You can't expect your friends to meet all your needs. You have to take responsibility. And you have to take responsibility in a loving way, not in this way of, oh, I'm weak, or, oh, I don't need that, or I don't deserve that. But no, if you love this person that you are, well, this is something that I think needs to take interest. So again, take a look at your love language. Take a look at the love languages of the people around you. See how you can build that emotional currency in your relationships, at work, in your marriage, with your children. If you're having tension in a relationship, whether it's professionally, romantically, in your marriage, friendships, if you want to build back that relationship, look at ways to increase the emotional currency through that exchange. Figure out what can be done and start there. Because if there's no relationship, there's really no change. And people are very suspect and aware of being manipulated. So that's all I got for you today. So thank you for your participation and attention. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week. And if this is helpful to somebody you know or somebody who might benefit, please share it with them. Go out and smuggle some hope wherever you can, guys.